Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another session of hashtag Gather to Grow here on Food from Zanzi's Twitter Spaces. I'm your host, Donumdu, and it's a pleasure to be back with you once again in the space. I hope your week has been well. I hope it's been productive. I hope you've gotten, what you wanted out of it. Thank you so much to the regulars. For those who are new here, this is a very interactive platform where we talk about various things to do with agriculture. And tonight we're talking mariculture. My speakers are already in the space, and I'd like to thank them for being here. So, as you guys know, I usually start with a round of introductions. So, I'm going to give Timothy a chance to introduce himself, tell us who he is, what he does within agriculture, and where his exciting journey started. Thank you so much, Timothy. Over to you.
My name is Timothy. I'm from Cape Town. I switched over to aquaculture, and then I completed my master's in aquaculture at the Stellenbosch University. After that, I basically focused on rainbow trout. Started out as the hatchery manager at Three Streams, and then I later on moved over to compliance. And recently, I started a startup called Atlantic Ornamental. Still very in its infant stages, but hopefully the plan is to vitalize a key aquaculture facility that has been basically, if I can say, the start of the rainbow trout in South Africa. That's it for my side.
Thank you so much, Timothy, and thank you so much for giving us a brief overview of the work that you do and more about your company, Atlantic Ornamentals. It's a pleasure to have you with us and joining us for the conversation. My next speaker, I think, needs little to no introduction. When it comes to aquaculture, David Fincham always comes to mind. David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, to join us once again to focus on mariculture and the opportunity specifically for new farmers in the sector. Maybe more about what you do within agriculture and aquaculture specifically, and more about your company, David Fincham Aquaculture. Thanks, David.
Hi, Dawn, and hi, listeners, fellow colleagues. It's great to be on the platform again and to discuss mariculture, which is very different to what we do in terms of freshwater aquaculture. But it is an aquaculture space, and it's a space that's growing rapidly around the world. And one of the most exciting things about mariculture is that there's so little that we yet know about fish in the ocean and about the ocean itself. In fact, they say we know more about the moon than we know about the ocean. It's great to see that people are showing an interest in mariculture in South Africa. We have a very long coastline, and there are opportunities to develop mariculture systems and to be able to farm with different species. I do believe that some of our pioneers in this space are probably a few years ahead of where they needed to be, but they've certainly laid some great foundation work for the farming of dusky cob and yellowtail. There are more on the platform that know more about that than I do.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for that context. I'm hoping to start with a kind of broader perspective of the sector to figure out, where we stand comparatively, as a country producing under the specific commodity in the specific way. So thank you so much for just touching on that very briefly as part of your introduction. I appreciate it. My next speaker is Natalie van Wyk. She is the production scientist for the Department of Agriculture, Environmental Affairs and Rural Development and Land Reform in the Northern Cape. I met her a few weeks ago and she's been such a gem. She has really connected me with amazing people in the sector. So grateful, for that connections and for having her join us on the space once again. She was with us when we spoke about aquaculture a few weeks ago. So Natalie, just maybe for those that might not know you, maybe a bit about who you are, what you do within agriculture, and also, this topic, it's close to your heart, right?
Thank you so much, Dawn. Yes, that's correct. This is something that I'm passionate about. I've been passionate about it since deciding to specialize in aquaculture following the study route with Timothy at the University of Stellenbosch. We were actually classmates doing our postgraduate diploma in aquaculture at the university. Yeah, just like you mentioned in my introduction, I'm a production scientist at the Northern Cape Department of Agriculture. We've got a really long name, but you mentioned it already. Like you said, this is my passion. I assist the producers, our commercial producers on our coastline. We have about 3 producers on our coastline at the moment, so there is room, as the previous speaker, Mr. David, has mentioned, there's room for production to increase. Looking at shellfish production, especially considering the type of coastline that we have, there are certain factors that obviously you would need to take into consideration when going into a production system like this, because it's a very specialized field of agriculture. But yes, we'll speak about that as the conversation continues. Thanks so much, Dawn.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I appreciate also just your insights, and I'm hoping to get, into the gist of it shortly. I just want to introduce my last speaker, Andre Bok, who is the Managing Director of Kingfish Enterprises. Thank you so much, Andre, for being here and for being part of this conversation. Maybe just more about you, your journey within agriculture and specifically aquaculture, and more about your business. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Dawn. My personal background is I'm a marine scientist by training, but I've worked in the marine aquaculture industry for 30 years now. I've worked in large marine aquariums, so Shark Marine World, the old SeaWorld Aquarium, various abalone farms, where I've worked as production manager or farm manager. For the last 14 years, I've been working on a project in East London to develop the farming of dusky cob and Cape yellowtail in land-based marine production systems, so recirculating aquaculture systems. We also have a little oyster hatchery, which we produce little oyster spat for the oyster farming industry. So, yeah, that's pretty much my background.
Thank you so much, Andre. And I must say, I am very happy to have all of my speakers, in the space tonight. I think I say this time and time again, these sessions are so valuable to me, and the value is not just in having the conversation here with everyone, but it's available afterwards for people to reference. And I'm going to start with my first question, and maybe ask Natalie to take this one. What is mariculture? Maybe you can just start with an introduction, Natalie. Thank you so much.
So I'm just going to do an introduction of mariculture. I'm going to do the definition according to the FAO, which sets it out very nicely. It's a farming practice of aquatic organisms, including fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and aquatic plants. So when we say farming, we're implying that there's intervention in the rearing process to enhance production, such as regular stocking, feeding, protection from predators. Farming also implies, and I really want to emphasize this because some people, especially when it comes to the different methodologies used within mariculture, people forget that there's ownership involved. So farming implies there's ownership of the stock. Differentiate aquaculture and fisheries, though. In the rearing period, the rearing period of the aquatic organisms, if you have ownership of that organism from the point of hatching to the point of growing out and marketing the organism, it contributes to aquaculture in the broader sense, and mariculture if it is marine species.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and apologies, I think maybe the network was struggling there a little bit. So thank you so much for that. My second question would be around, giving us some broader perspective on the sector. I think as part of Natalie's introduction, she spoke about 2 producers. What are we producing in terms of mariculture? How are we faring, and how do we compare to the rest of Africa, the rest of the world? David or Andre, Timothy, whoever unmutes their mic first, you guys can go ahead. Thanks.
The big difference between aquaculture and mariculture, and Natalie did say this, but I think we lost a little bit there with the network, is that mariculture is really a subsector of aquaculture. So mariculture implies marine aquaculture farming. So anything that you're farming in the sea or in a marine environment is classified as mariculture. And that can be algae or seaweeds, plants, invertebrates, which are shellfish, like Natalie mentioned earlier, abalone, oysters, or marine fish, like dusky cob or yellowtail. That is a very broad definition of mariculture. And in the South African context, the biggest value mariculture industry by value is the abalone farming industry. Abalone is a little marine snail. It grows in the intertidal and subtidal zones of our coastline, taken in high regard in the East. So in China, Japan, Korea, etc. They particularly like our abalone. Abalone colloquially in South Africa is also called perlemoen. the biggest value farmers in South Africa are producing abalone. So South Africa exports probably about 1,500 tons of abalone, farmed abalone, every year to the east. And there are probably about 14 or so abalone farms. It's a very capital intensive business. So a lot of money to get set up, and abalone grows slowly. So they take 4 to 5 years to get to market size. So you have to operate that farm, pay the salaries, pay the rent, pay your interest, etc., for 4 or 5 years before you actually start getting any income back. Luckily, the value of the abalone is quite high, so it does make it worthwhile for you to do that. The next biggest farming industry is in South Africa in terms of mariculture would be the shellfish. So that would be your mussel farming industry, which is a bivalve. It's got 2 shells that close around a little mussel, and they filter feed algae out of the water and grow and produce a nice meat inside the shell, which is actually full of mostly gonad, which is the reproductive organ of the mussel. The next biggest after that would be oyster farming. Most of these, the shellfish farming industries, the mussels and oysters are actually concentrated along the west coast, where there's a lot of primary production. So a lot of algae is produced there, upwellings. That cold water that you get along the west coast of South Africa is very nutrient rich. That produces good ground or fertilizer for seaweeds, unicellular seaweeds, so tiny little seaweeds. And the mussels and oysters really enjoy that. So they gulp that down and they grow really well. That is mostly the biggest players in the marine aquaculture industry. Kingfish Enterprises is the only marine fish farm in South Africa. We're based in the East London Industrial Development Zone. And we've been selling farmed dusky cob and yellowtail into the South African market for the last almost 2 years now. In African and global context, the most valuable mariculture players are the abalone farmers. I think we have the largest abalone farming industry outside of China, and all of our product goes into China. It's a big industry, it's a high value industry, and by far the biggest player in the local mariculture industry. The research institutions are always looking for new opportunities. Like at the moment, they're looking at sea urchins. There's a market for sea urchins in the east, sea cucumbers, which are also very popular in the east. We've tried to farm fish in the sea, in cages in the sea, which is basically putting a net pen in the sea and putting fish in there and feeding them. It was very difficult to do because our coastline is very dynamic, a lot of waves, a lot of currents, a lot of water temperature changes, and it makes farming along the South African coastline very difficult. Just to look at some of the mariculture industries internationally, I mean, the salmon farming industry in Norway produces about close to 1.5 million tons of salmon per annum, only coming out of Norway. And that is exported mainly to Europe, to America, and to Japan. It's flown out. It's a high quality product. But after oil, that's the second biggest industry in Norway. Chile, for instance, also farms, I think it's about 700,000 tons of salmon. So those are really big players in the mariculture industry. In the Mediterranean, they're farming sea bream and sea bass, 300, 400,000 tons. So relative to the rest of the world, South Africa is a really small player in the mariculture industry. But by value, our shining star is definitely the abalone farming industry, which exports most of its product to China and Japan and Korea. I think that sort of gives an overview of the African context. In terms of mariculture, I think we're probably the largest player in the African context when it comes to mariculture, and that's probably most likely got to do with the value of our abalone that we export. Egypt does they've got a lot of freshwater aquaculture like tilapia and so on, and David will know more about that than me. But there is a small mariculture industry in Egypt, Mauritania, and so on. But I think by far the biggest in terms of value would be the South African abalone farming industry.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you've actually touched on a few of my other questions that I was, incorporating as part of the conversation that we'd be having. You'll read the news and you'll always hear of poachers being caught. There's always stories around the abalone industry and the controversy around it, quotas and things around that. So maybe if we can touch on that briefly towards the end, that would also be good for some extra context as well for those that might not know too much about it. But then again, I want to focus on the methods. You spoke about all of them very briefly, but maybe if we can just go a little bit deeper to understand it for maybe people who are interested. some of the costs involved? Is it viable for people to enter? At what scale? If I'm looking to diversify and I'm on a coastline, is that something that I can think about? I don't know who'd like to take this one. David, maybe you can talk a little bit on that question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't costs and things on mariculture. I'm not an expert in that field. One of the questions you asked was drawbacks, and I think we should address that because, we do have Operation Pakisa, which focuses on the blue economy, which is the ocean economy. The kind of drawbacks that the sector faces both in mariculture and aquaculture is in getting through the permitting, licensing, EIA kind of processes. And discussions with government have taken a long, long time to get us to a point where some of the legislation that is being put in place, and it's not a South African problem when it comes to legislation with aquaculture and mariculture. I mean, if anybody would really be interested in having a look at this space, it'd be prudent to look at the kind of conversations that are happening worldwide around aquaculture and mariculture. Because we're a new industry, and we perceive to be an industry that impacts the ocean and the environment and the beauty of kind of natural places such as the fjords in Norway, or if you looked at even mussel farming, the Knysna Lagoon. And so those issues really hold the industry back. And there's a lot of also misinformation and false reporting and activism around both mariculture and aquaculture. In terms of operational costs, most fish production systems and that the biggest costs we have is feeding our livestock. But that's also true for the chicken industry, the pork industry, the cattle industry. And there has to be a much bigger appreciation for what aquaculture can bring to other farming operations. We are huge consumers of maize and soya and other cereal crops. And that just adds to us promoting the production of those crops and grains from traditional agriculture. And so, we can't look at these sectors and operations in isolation. We have to look at them in their totality, including job creation, protection of the environment, biodiversity, and all of those things. Obviously, the different farming sectors, in terms of cost, you'd have to look at the capital cost of developing the infrastructure, and then have a look at your operational costs, which I say basically are feed, labor, and if you're land-based, then obviously energy becomes a very, very critical factor.
Thank you so much, David. I want to thank you for just bringing a broader context to the conversation, and I think it's definitely something that we had touched on in our previous conversation with Natalie and others, focusing on the broader overall industry in aquaculture and how that fits into the big agricultural landscape, and also around our culture and what we consume and how much we consume, and the end consumer also being a key focus there, and it maybe not moving as fast as we would like. Natalie or Timothy, would you guys like to contribute at all to what David has mentioned? And then I'll think I'm going to move on to my next question around, markets, local export markets, and some of the other product that we could possibly be focusing on. What are some of the other processing elements? I think Andre spoke about sea cucumbers, sea urchins, seaweed. Where does those other products filter to along the value chain? Timothy, Natalie?
Timothy, I think you can just add on to what I'm saying. David was touching base on your different systems and the implications. That is a huge drawback to this industry, is the setup of, or starting as a new entrant coming into this industry. It could be quite daunting to view the capital cost, the initial cost input into starting a venture like this one. But there are different methodologies, and as part of government, we are looking at methodologies that are more affordable and for our small-scale producers, because, I would say, in my opinion, it would be more advisable to start small-scale, get into the local market, and then upscale your business gradually, getting to the export market. But there are various ways of getting into this industry with different methodologies that are available. There's sea-based methodologies, there's land-based methodologies that they have touched on. And your sea-based methodologies depends on the species that you are producing. So with mussel farming, you'd have long lines. in the broader spectrum, I mean, in terms of infrastructure that would be required, it's not as capital intensive in relation or in comparison to other industries or species that you are farming. Ranching as the biggest drawback of ranching is probably the theft. People forget that, especially on the West Coast, we have the problem of the theft of our abalone, because people forget that that actually belongs to someone. It's not naturally occurring on the West Coast. So that means whatever abalone that you do find out in the water, it's being reared in a natural system, but it's being reared nonetheless. There's ownership involved. So sea cages are something that we are considering. We do have a very active coastline in terms of wave activity, but we are looking at deep cage culture in the future, deep sea cages. And then with land-based, you have your tanks and your raceways, and even we are looking at ponds for the growth of oysters, as well as your integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems, where you can do your filter feeders along with your pelagic fish species like the mullet, and incorporate or get two products from one pond system, which then, if you look at the cost factor, it starts to make sense a bit in the long run.
Thank you so much. Timothy, anything that you'd like to add on your side? And I know we're kind of talking about these species very openly. We didn't list them specifically, but I think everyone kind of touched on it briefly. I think Andre touched on it, David touched on it. So I don't know if it's worth it to maybe do like a type of list. I think Andre was very clear when he spoke about what's most popular, the abalone and the other species as well. But would it be worthwhile to maybe just list the species from your side, Timothy? Thank you so much.
Andre listed the species quite well because we don't have a lot of species that's commercially viable in South Africa at the moment. Abalone is one. You have your mussels, you have your oysters. And then you mentioned that kingfish enterprises are the only finfish marine system in South Africa. The other species, they are being researched, as he says. That has been going on for a while. I'm not sure how far they are, if there has been pilot projects. I know pilot projects has been done on ocean trout, even tilapia to a certain extent. The majority of these projects failed for various reasons. They have touched on a lot of things that I would have mentioned, but maybe I can touch on something else.
Thanks, Timothy. I appreciate it, and thanks for listing those again. Now let's talk about local markets, and again viability for new entrants. Is it very competitive? Andre, you're producing, others within the sector. For those listening who might be interested, do they work with established producers? Is there opportunities to diversify and do other things? Skincare products, is that something that people look at? What are the other options that are out there? David or Andre?
I just wanted to mention also that, Dawn, you were mentioning the different methods, but I didn't mention that there are different phases of production that people, new entrants, could also incorporate into. You have your nursery side that is a bit more specialized, but then you have your grow out phases. There are different phases that you could come into industry with a different species. So it doesn't need to be the entire growth from hatch to market size. I just wanted to mention that so that people are not daunted by the fact that to get into this industry is so expensive. You can phase in gradually with different phases to specialize on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that context. I think it definitely helps, especially, considering the people who are in the space who maybe want to understand the industry setup a little bit better. Andre, over to you.
I can comment on that. Maybe I should just carry on from where, the point that Natalie made is that, for instance, as an example, while Kingfish Enterprises is a land-based marine fish farm, we do have an oyster hatchery which produces tiny little oysters. So we spawn the oysters, we raise the larvae till they're about 3 or 4 millimeters, and then we have a partnership with the Siazama community in Hamburg, the mouth of the Keiskammer River, where there used to be an oyster farm that was not economically viable for various reasons. And it's a whole community. So there are 40 or so cooperative members but they really have a mariculture right. They have that right over the old oyster farm. Although there were no oysters being farmed there, they retained that right. And we saw an opportunity to work together with them to use that site as a nursery. And that's exactly what Natalie was saying. So we don't grow the oysters out to market size. That's an edible oyster. We take our little spat, we call them spat when they're tiny like that, because they look like little pieces of sand. We move them down there and we grow them up from 3 or 4 millimeters to a size of about 20 millimeters. So about 8 grams. That's about half of your thumb kind of thing, that size. And then we sell those juvenile oysters to oyster farmers. So we don't do the whole growth cycle, but we managed to make a business out of mariculture, of farming of oysters, and we're including a whole community in that. So we pay the community a rental fee for the right to use their infrastructure. The World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, is providing seed capital to buy the equipment for the oyster farming initiative or the oyster nursery initiative in the Keiskamma River mouth. And we are leasing or renting that equipment back from the community. So the WWF have bought the equipment, donated it to the community, and we are leasing that equipment back. And we have a management contract over that site for a period of 5 years. We've negotiated with the community, and we employ them, and we pay them a commission on every oyster that we sell. So I think that way we are really trying to, do the best of both worlds. It's a high cost kind of industry to get into, but here we are roping in rural community members into our project and having them as stakeholders and shareholders and benefiting from the project. That's one aspect. And I think that there are other examples of that along the West Coast in Saldanha Bay area where similar types of initiatives have been set up with the mussel farmers. So, there would be a community initiative where certain mussel rafts would belong to certain community members, and they would all sell their market-sized mussels to a processing facility. And that way you can incorporate, and those community farmers get funding to build their mussel raft and funding assistance to build their mussel rafts and operate them, just seed funding to get them going. So that way you're building an industry from the ground up. But in general, mariculture is a capital-intensive industry. These abalone farms being operated now, some of the farms are producing 500 tons of abalone per annum. It's hundreds of millions of rands of capital infrastructure that's gone in there. And there's no ways that you and I can afford that type of investment. It's an institutional investment. You have to have deep pockets to be able to do that. Even our venture in the East London Industrial Development Zone, we have 14 high net wealth individuals who've clubbed together to make that investment happen. And so it's cost millions of rands to get it together. So you have this range of possibilities, but I think that the majority of them are founded upon high capital cost mariculture ventures, and the spin-offs are really going attempt to benefit rural communities or people trying to farm from the ground up as well, because it's a win-win for both operators. For instance, the Hamburg estuary or the Keiskamma River mouth estuary is a fantastic estuary to farm oysters in. And the estuary is communities. They have, not only do they live there, they have a right to farm oysters there. And it's a win-win for both our business as well as for them. So I think one needs, there are various other opportunities that do have potential that could benefit rural communities, but they take time and they take resources, and generally they need, especially to get set up, they need the expertise of the established abalone farmers or mariculturists to actually get those smaller secondary industries operating and off the ground. So I don't know if that, I've been talking for a long time, but I don't know if hopefully that answers the question that you asked initially.
Yeah, no, definitely it does. And it also touches on a comment that David placed on our chat box. He said that setup is based on budget and available capital and working capital, collaborations and networking together with knowledge transfer, experience and mentorship is critical to developing the value chain. And I think that in a nutshell brings together what you were trying to highlight, Andre. I have another speaker who would like to contribute. Gugulethu Mahlangu is one of my favorite farmers. And she's also working in the aquaculture sector. I'm so happy that you joined us, Gugu. Maybe you just want to tell us who you are briefly for those that might not know you, and also just your question. The floor is yours. Thanks, Gugu.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much for the space. And I see all the wonderful aquaculturists that I look up to are also on here. I just have a quick question for, I think it was Andre now who was speaking more on the availability and kind of access to aquaculture, right, as an industry. For me, sometimes it can feel a bit isolated, like us ordinary people can never really attain the success of aquaculture or marine culture. Because currently I know of a guy who is buying out his farm, selling out his farm, and he's selling it out to these guys who have identified an export market to sell rare ornamental fish. And this fish can also be traded on Forex. And it seems that when we speak about marine culture or aquaculture, there is no success aside from including foreign investments. And I just wanted to ask the speakers, how can small scale farmers branch out into aquaculture realistically and actually make it? At times, people are saying that the model for tilapia isn't feasible. The model for marine culture isn't feasible inland. I'm talking about the cities, and that's where we are. And that's where we are trying to kind of introduce aquaculture or the fusion of aquaculture and plants. But it's becoming bleak. It looks bleak because people who are successful are speaking of foreign invasive fish species. They're speaking about rare exotic fish, and they're definitely not going to keep it local. They're definitely going to be trading in US dollars. So I just wanted to put it up to the floor to hear what they think.
Thank you so much, Gugu, and thank you so much for your insights and your question. I think David has been quite busy in the chats, but maybe David, you can take this one. I think you were touching on it in the beginning, but maybe you can just respond to Gugu's question. Thanks.
Hi, Dawn. Gugu, thanks very much for those comments and those questions. The success of a business is based on the person who sets up that business, owns that business, runs and operates that business. One of the comments I made on the tweets was to say that if you look at the mussel farming industry in South Africa, where there was a move to transfer the farms from their current ownership to previously disadvantaged and worker-based ownership, when those farms were transferred, the only thing that changed in those business was the top management structure and the ownership. The farmers and the operators and the people who were responsible for the production were as competent and as experienced and knowledgeable as they were when under the old ownership. But unless you can carry on the business operations, which includes the funding, the financing, the raising of capital, the marketing and the sales and those aspects of the business, that farm then becomes a failure. It can continue to produce, but without the top-end structures in terms of sales, marketing, processing, it cannot operate as a business. And often we've seen that, certainly in aquaculture projects and many, many other projects. If you take the tea farm in Zanin, and the failure is not from the workers that operate the farm, it's not from the government who organized the transfer, it's not from the senior structure that were paid and who had left. It's from a pure business aspect. And we have to start looking at what we're doing and how we're doing it in terms of maintaining the success of well-established businesses. Some of these operations are maybe 30, 40, 50 years old. But the minute that the transfer happens, there is no sustainability and success left in the business.
Dawn, if I could make a comment about Gugu's question as well.
Yes, for sure.
Thanks. I share Gugu's frustration. The position I'm in today is managing a large land-based marine fish farm, but it hasn't come lightly. It's 30 years of late nights, weekends, many different jobs, many different opportunities, and many different failures to actually get where to actually operate a facility like this now. And I'm not an owner of the facility. I might have a very, very small shareholding. But I started out as a new graduate, much like Timothy and Natalie, with a passion for marine aquaculture. And it's taken 30 years of trial and error to get where I am now. And it is frustrating and it is painful that we don't want to export the product. We want to service the local market if we can. And that's what we're trying to do. I mean, the wild fishery for cob along the whole South African coastline is between 200 and 400 tons per annum. And we are planning to produce 300 tons of fish per annum. So we're basically producing an amount of fish to supply the local market that's equal to the wild fishery, which, from an environmental perspective is a good thing. Price, we're making jobs locally. All that salmon that comes into South Africa is imported from Norway. We import between 2,000 and 3,000 tons of Atlantic salmon from Norway every year into South Africa. We're exporting all those jobs, all that foreign currency, everything. And that's another opportunity that is a possibility, is farming Atlantic salmon locally to supply the local market. But that comes at a cost. It's very expensive to do that. That's hundreds of millions of rand to set up a facility like that. The value that we've seen in order to make these businesses work, and that's an important point that David brought up there, is how to manage these businesses efficiently. The value in these businesses is actually, to date, has been mainly in the export market. And that's frustrating. It is sad because we want to add value locally, create jobs and all of that locally. But, we soldier on. The institutions that support Timothy and Natalie and are working at researching, developing new species all the time, trying to create opportunities. And mariculture is a pioneering industry internationally. I mean, the first time we bred a cob for the first time ever was about 18 years ago. That's the first time a cob has ever been bred in captivity, and now we're farming it commercially. If you think about sheep or goats or cattle or whatever, that we've been farming those for thousands of years. So we have that understanding. What we are working with now is a pioneering industry, and it sounds all exciting, but it all comes at a cost because you make mistakes. And those mistakes, that's, I think, the bottom line. I mean, there's opportunity, but where there's opportunity, there's risk. And it's all about understanding that risk and implementing your operations to minimize that risk so that you make your business a success.
Thank you so much, Andre. Gugu, I saw you had your hand up, but also Natalie. Natalie, I'm going to give you a chance to speak. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I think that what Mr. Bok was saying was the risk involved. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is actually overcoming that fear of the risk that's involved, to be honest. I mean, I've been trying to get into industry for quite some time, but to do a startup and to get into industry as an individual in this space, it is daunting to consider. But in the research space, again, there's so much opportunities. I mean, if you look at what the United Nations have put forward in terms of sustainability, mariculture needs to be on the table for more consideration or more in-depth consideration, because mariculture is what's going to feed us in the future. Mussels are one of the food sources that they see as food for the future. Those are one of the products that they mentioned. Aside from larvae, worms, I'm talking about the Mumpani worms that we already have in our diets up north, but mussels as a product of mariculture is something that the people looking at the sustainability of mariculture deem mussels as that important. And I think that is something that the platform needs to be aware of.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Gugu, you wanted to add something? I will give you the floor.
With regards to what David was saying, it's all about the structure, right? Because with this guys that I know, right, they are basically buying this farm. It's a CC, and the owner of the farm is going to retain a share in it. So he is going to make sure that there are inverters, there's solar panels to make sure that the farm is running efficiently in terms of electricity. And he's going to retain a share in it because he has seen that his farm is not sustainable. He has worked over it for many years, but he's just not lucky. And when you look at those case studies, it kind of is daunting because it's like, am I going to win? When experienced, skilled farmers are saying that this is not a model that's working for me, and they would rather opt for getting foreign investments that are going to be doing the rare endangered species and exporting it as well and trading on it. And also, they are raising funds as a startup, but they'll acquire some more funds just to expand it. But it's really expensive, and it's almost like you're throwing in the towel and saying, you know what, I'd rather go with the foreign investments. When you look at aquaponics as well, it attracts foreign investments, but when you're trying to sell it locally, there are just so many challenges to break through in introducing marine culture and aquaponics and aquaculture as an alternative protein source. So it is very tricky, and I'm just so bummed I joined so late. I really would have loved to hear all the speakers and their insights, but thanks again, Dawn.
Thank you so much, Gugu. Maybe just a few comments that I want to share again from David. He was just commenting on what Andre was saying that it basically sums up the situation. The expectation that farming, and in particular aquaculture, is easy is that it is not. It can be very successful, but it requires a huge commitment and all the pieces of the puzzle on the table. And that's exactly what Gugu was saying as well. I think we've gone through so many aspects of mariculture, aquaculture, thinking about the two and how people could possibly enter, how to diversify with it, what the challenges are, what the various drawbacks for people, the market. And we've listed a number of things that has to do with the industry. But if I can just maybe do one round with all of our speakers, just to get them to kind of, contribute as a final comment. I don't want it to end on a somber note. If there's hope, how can we be hopeful? How can we invest more and find out more about the research? If someone walks away from the session, have them think about something that they can actively do to contribute towards growing this industry specifically. Andre, the floor is yours. Thanks.
I think that not to be, completely despondent. I know it is very frustrating, and I empathize, completely with Gugu. I think that the opportunity lies in collaborating with existing mariculture operations for those secondary benefit opportunities that are there. And I'll give you one example. I'm situated in East London, right next to the Wild Coast, and there's a rock lobster fishery along the Wild Coast. And the Wild Coast is community land. There's a whole lot of cooperatives and people that live in that area. And traditionally, those rock lobsters are sold to tourists who go in there, and they're selling them for 10 or 20 rand a rock lobster or a crayfish. What's happening now is that they're associated with one of the large aquaculture operations, is that they're actually working together to keep those rock lobster or those crayfish alive, so that all the community's catches go into live holding tanks at different collecting places along the coastline. They're kept alive, and they exported for a much higher price alive. And it's only because that mariculture operation has that base of operations and those expertise that this opportunity has come up for local communities. And it takes someone skilled in marketing operations to coordinate all of that, and that's just one opportunity. So I think that one really needs to look at dovetailing or secondary beneficiation from existing mariculture operations, especially if you're a small operator and you want to make a livelihood for yourself as an independent, not requiring a huge amount of capital. That's just one example. And I think if you think creatively, like what we're doing with the Siazama community down in Hamburg, the Keiskammer River, there are other opportunities like that. It just takes someone who's dedicated and who's, committed and who is effective to actually make that opportunity work.
Thanks, Andre. Natalie, your hand is up.
I just actually wanted to build on what Andre just mentioned, and then just further add on to it. The commitment needs to be there for us to engage in this form of ventures. If we look at mariculture, the industry, and we look at what the United Nations are trying to accomplish as well, mariculture would be able to, with all the products that could be farmed with mariculture, it would speak to about 7 of the 17 goals that the United Nations are trying to achieve through mariculture or aquaculture in the broader spectrum in terms of the ocean's economy. It would speak to zero hunger. It would speak to good health and well-being. It would speak to quality education. It would speak to decent work and economic growth. It speaks to responsible consumption and production. It speaks to climate action, because with the production of seaweed, you have carbon uptake. This is something that we are not focusing on in this session, but with producing seaweeds, the various types of seaweeds, you are taking carbon and nitrogen that's being absorbed into the seaweed production. So you're speaking to life below water, which eventually, and using seaweed as an example, you could implement seaweed into different aspects of agriculture. Seaweed could be a supplement as a fodder feed for livestock. But we need to speak to our sustainability goals on a global scale, and South Africa needs to form part of that so that mariculture can grow and we actually become competitive on a global scale.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that context and for listing it so beautifully. I think that's definitely something that we can even touch on as part of another conversation. Timothy, can I get your thoughts, final comments? Also, maybe more about what you envision as someone that's not new in the industry, but you've just started your business. What advice would you give to others who's looking to, venture into this specific stream? Thanks.
I just want to say I also share Gugu's frustration. And, you have the United Nations, they have their goals. You have all of these things on paper that say where we would like to go, where we would like to end up. And it's very difficult to be extremely positive to say that we are going in that direction. But in actual fact, do we have more farms within aquaculture starting out? Do we have farms that actually start out and they can be sustainable? It's very difficult to answer these questions. Like Andre, they are the only finfish marine mariculture farm business, because it is very difficult, like they mentioned, with the market, with finances and all of that. And you have institutions and you have all of these programs that want to assist you to start out and assist you to start up and all of these things. But at the end of the day, you can get a system. Someone can build you a system. You can get a piece of land. You can get access to various things. You can get rights to be at specific places. But at the end of the day, you need a market. You need guidance on those levels, like David mentioned earlier. And I think for us in South Africa, that is what is missing. And I think that is why so many businesses fail, is that we don't have platforms and individuals who can mentor new entrants into the market, farms starting out, those type of things. We have very much focus on building systems, training people onto how to run systems, training people how to farm. But what do you do when you sit with a product? We don't have as many people going beyond that point. As someone going into the industry, as someone starting out, it's not as difficult to get the ball rolling on getting access to land and starting off something, getting a system, all of those things. What is becoming difficult is, what am I going to do with my product? And I think that's where we need to focus a little bit more on.
Thank you so much, Timothy, for your insights and for sharing some of your lived experience and, how you kind of think about the future for yourself and others within the sector. Thank you so much. David, you have the last word. Just your final insights, final comments, something that you'd like to add as we wrap up. Thank you.
I'm going to quote something that I've kind of lived by and worked by, and that's never, never, never give up. If you've got a dream and a passion, it's up to you to follow it and make it happen. And the only way that you can do that is to network and to build and to be tenacious in your approach to what you want to do. We started with nothing and we grew a business and we networked and we put money back into the business. So it's possible. And even if you have to start small, go and find those opportunities. There are opportunities to go and visit farms. There are opportunities to speak to any of the specialists in the area of your interest. And you just need, and it's much easier today with platforms like the one we've got this evening, with other social media platforms, to make contact with people and to get the support that you need. And in doing that, we'll build what we need within each of our sectors. And that's the critical mass. The more people we've got involved, the more farmers we have involved, the more we're producing, the easier it'll become. The aquaculture industry is still full of pioneers. I've got recently WhatsApp groups where within a week we've got over 1,000 members on that group worldwide. And so you have to really, really give your all and put a lot of effort into it. The funding is available. We have Operation Pakiso, we have ADEP funding, we have rural development and all of these organizations that have funding available. But unless you can prove that you're already interested and that you're doing something and that you are successful in what you're doing and that you have a vision for the future, then people are not going to support you. And Tim's right. If you look at all of the SDGs, aquaculture addresses many of those SDGs. And you're not going to start with an operation without any experience or knowledge developing a multi-million rand operation. But start small and build that operation so that people see that you are committed and you can get the buy-in. And specifically, in terms of supporting each other within the sector. And as I've said to you, if you go through the aquaculture sector, we are still pioneers. Certainly less than 1,000 people in South Africa who you could consider as people being really serious about the industry. But from 1,000 people, we can get to 10,000 people, we can get 100,000 people.
Thank you so much, David, Timothy, Natalie, Andre, Guguletu, for joining us afterwards. I really appreciate all of your insights, for sharing your hearts and your love for this industry, but more so, giving us an idea of where we're at and where we can be going and where we should be going. I think when we think about the funding, that's available through the various platforms and, institutions that David has just listed, aquaculture is a big player. That says something to me. And I hope that your work will continue to grow, that your business will continue to grow. And I hope that this small contribution and we'll continue to champion, all of you and this entire industry from outside at Food for Mzansi. And we'll continue to create these platforms to have these conversations and to engage with you about this industry and also just to bring more people into your circle so that we can get that 1,000 to 10,000 and to 100,000, David. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. I'm looking forward to having you guys with me again next week. Have a great rest of the evening. From my side, Donum, your host. Blessed week and all the best with your farming. Bye-bye for now.